The largest cargo bay on the station had been converted into a circular workspace, with the Nexus crown fragments at its center. Representatives from 37 different species arranged themselves around the ancient artifact, each bringing their own understanding of gentle healing and restoration. The diversity was breathtaking. Crystalline beings who sang harmonic frequencies, aquatic creatures who used empathic resonance, plant-like entities who grew healing energies, and mechanical species who understood the poetry of perfect engineering. Marcus stood beside the containment field, looking at the assembled beings who had traveled across the galaxy to attempt something unprecedented. He felt the weight of responsibility for the project, but also a deep sense of hope. In the 3 weeks since Ambassador Thex 5 had first shown him the crown fragments, he had come to understand that this was about much more than repairing an ancient artifact. "Before we begin," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly through the translation systems that allowed all the species to communicate, "I want everyone to understand what we are attempting. This crown was not just broken by physical force. It was shattered by fear, mistrust, and the failure of different civilizations to work together. To heal it, we must heal those ancient wounds." Vel 9's crystalline form chimed softly as they spoke. "Among my people, we believe that broken things can be made stronger than they were before, but only if the healing process includes understanding and forgiveness." Zarathek stood in her gleaming armor, which had become a symbol of successful, gentle healing. "The human Marcus taught me that true strength sometimes means choosing patience over force, understanding over conquest. This lesson transformed not just my armor, but my understanding of what it means to be a warrior." Dr. Sage 7, an elderly Terran folk healer whose rocky skin was covered in patterns that told the story of centuries of wisdom, nodded slowly. "The crown fragments carry the memory of violence done to them. We must show them a different memory, the memory of cooperation and mutual support between species." Marcus had spent days studying each species' healing traditions, learning how they approached the restoration of damaged or traumatized systems. The Melodians used songs that could restructure matter at the molecular level. The empaths shared emotional energy that could calm chaotic systems. The flow dancers used movement and rhythm to guide energy into proper patterns. Each tradition offered a different piece of the puzzle. "We will not try to force the fragments back together," Marcus explained. "Instead, we will create an environment of such perfect trust and cooperation that the crown will choose to heal itself, because that is what it was designed to facilitate." The process began slowly and gently. The Melodians started with a soft humming that seemed to resonate through the very structure of the station. The sound was not directed at the crown fragments, but rather filled the space around them with harmonious vibrations that spoke of peace and unity. The crystalline collective added their own harmonic frequencies, not trying to match the Melodians exactly, but creating complementary tones that wove together into something more beautiful than either could achieve alone. The empaths began sharing feelings of hope, trust, and mutual respect, their emotional energy creating a warm, welcoming atmosphere that filled the entire bay. Marcus watched the crown fragments carefully as the healing environment developed around them. At first, there was no visible change, but gradually, almost imperceptibly, the pieces began to orient themselves differently within the containment field. The chaotic spin that had characterized them for millennia slowly gave way to a more stable, rhythmic movement. "It is working," Ambassador Thex 5 whispered, her tentacles trembling with excitement. "The fragments are beginning to resonate with each other again." As the various species continued their gentle healing practices, Marcus noticed something wonderful happening among the healers themselves. The Terran folk began incorporating elements of the Melodian songs into their own earth rhythms. The flow dancers modified their movements to complement the emotional patterns being shared by the empaths. Without any central coordination, different healing traditions were naturally blending together into something greater than the sum of their parts. The crown fragments began to glow with soft light, and their movement within the containment field became more purposeful. They were not being pulled together by any external force, but rather seemed to be remembering their original pattern and choosing to return to it. "Look," Dr. Koss said, his medical scanners detecting changes in the crown's energy patterns. The fragments are generating their own reconstruction field. They are healing themselves using the harmony we have created around them. As the hours passed, more species joined the healing circle. News of the attempt had spread throughout the station, and beings who had not originally been part of the project asked to contribute their own gentle energies. The circle grew to include over 100 individuals from 50 different civilizations, each adding their unique understanding of healing and cooperation. The crown fragments began to move toward each other with increasing purpose. Where they touched, brilliant light flared as ancient connections were re-established. But this was not the same crown that had been shattered millennia ago. The healing process was transforming it into something new and better. The crown is not just being repaired, Vel 9 observed, their crystalline body ringing with harmonious frequencies. It is evolving. The healing we are providing is being incorporated into its structure. Marcus could see what Vel 9 meant. The crown's original design had been beautiful but somewhat rigid, reflecting the limited understanding of cooperation that had existed when it was first created. But the version emerging from this healing process was more flexible, more adaptive, incorporating the wisdom and healing traditions of dozens of species that had not even been part of galactic civilization when the crown was originally made. As the final fragments clicked into place, the completed crown began to sing. But this was not the single-voiced melody that ancient records described. This was a chorus, a symphony of different species' healing traditions woven together into something that spoke to the hearts of every being present. The crown's light expanded beyond the containment field, washing over the assembled healers with warm, connecting energy. For a brief moment, the barriers between species seemed to dissolve. The Melodians could feel the steady strength of the Terran folk. The empaths could sense the crystalline clarity of the collective's thoughts. The flow dancers could perceive the deep currents of wisdom that moved through the aquatic species. We are all connected, Ambassador Thex 5 said wonderfully, her voice filled with tears of joy. The crown is showing us what the galaxy could become if we chose cooperation over conflict, understanding over fear. When the light finally faded, the Nexus crown hovered in the air before them, no longer needing any containment field. It pulsed gently with its own inner light, and complex patterns flowed across its surface like living music made visible. Marcus approached the crown slowly, his hands extended but not quite touching it. "It is beautiful," he said softly. "But more than that, it is alive with the combined wisdom of everyone who helped heal it." Ambassador Thex 5 activated her communication device to contact the Galactic Council. "Honored counselors," she said, her voice shaking with emotion, "I am pleased to report that the Nexus crown has been restored. But more importantly, we have discovered a new model for galactic cooperation. The human Marcus Chen has shown us that healing, whether of technology, relationships, or civilizations themselves, requires patience, trust, and the willingness to work together despite our differences." As news of the successful restoration spread throughout the galaxy, Marcus found himself overwhelmed by the response. Species that had been isolated for centuries began reaching out to their neighbors. Ancient conflicts were reopened not for revenge, but for healing. The principles that had guided the crown's restoration became the foundation for a new age of galactic cooperation. Zarathek stood beside Marcus as they watched the crown's gentle light fill the bay with warmth and hope. "You sought only to repair my armor," the warrior said, her 4 hands resting gently on his shoulders. "But you have repaired something much greater, the trust between all the children of the stars." Marcus smiled, already thinking about the healing work that lay ahead. The galaxy was full of broken things that needed gentle care, and now he had an entire community of beings who understood that the strongest force in the universe was not violence or domination, but the patient, persistent power of love expressed through gentle, skillful action. The age of gentle healing had begun, and the stars themselves seemed to sing with joy. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison stood at attention as the massive doors of the Velnari Council chamber slowly opened with a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. The crystalline palace stretched before him, its walls made of living blue, crystal that pulsed with soft light. Everything here seemed to sing with a low, beautiful frequency that made his bones vibrate slightly. Jake had been preparing for this moment for 2 years. As the lead diplomatic officer aboard the UES Harmony, humanity's first interstellar peace vessel, he carried the hopes of his entire species. The 12 other races in the Galactic Council had barely acknowledged humanity's existence. To them, humans were newcomers, barely evolved beyond their primitive home planet. They called humans the feeling species, with obvious disgust as if emotions were some kind of disease. The other human diplomats walked beside him through the crystal corridor. Ambassador Chen whispered nervously about the importance of this meeting, but Jake barely heard her. His attention was focused on the figure waiting at the far end of the chamber. Princess Zarathel of the Velnari Empire stood perfectly still, her translucent blue form catching and reflecting light in ways that seemed impossible. She was tall and elegant, with features that were almost human but clearly alien. Her skin looked like living sapphire, and when she moved, it was with a grace that seemed to defy gravity. Most striking of all were her eyes, which glowed with an inner light that shifted from deep blue to silver as her emotions changed. The Velnari were ancient, far older than humanity. Their civilization had spanned the galaxy for thousands of years before humans had even learned to make fire. They were beings of pure logic and harmony, communicating through musical frequencies that could reshape matter at the molecular level. Emotions were considered a primitive weakness, something that inferior species clung to because they lacked the mental discipline for true civilization. As Jake approached the negotiating table, he noticed other alien representatives scattered throughout the chamber. The insectoid Thrax delegates clicked their mandibles in what he had learned was their version of laughter. The gaseous Etherians floated in their containment suits, their forms shifting with what Jake suspected was amusement. None of them expected humanity to succeed in these negotiations. The territorial dispute that brought them here was complex. Human colonies had expanded into a region of space that 3 different alien civilizations claimed as their ancestral territory. The Velnari Empire controlled the largest portion of the disputed area, but their claim was based on ancient treaties that predated human space travel by centuries. The situation had grown tense over the past months, with small skirmishes breaking out between human patrol ships and alien vessels. Princess Zarathel stepped forward as the negotiations began, her voice creating harmonics that the translation devices converted into perfect English. The human delegation will present their proposals first, she announced. Her tone was completely neutral, professional, but Jake found himself studying the subtle changes in her crystal-like features. Ambassador Chen began reading from their prepared statements, outlining humanity's need for expansion and their willingness to share the disputed territories. The proposals were reasonable, carefully crafted to appeal to the logical nature of their hosts. They offered technological exchanges, joint research projects, and mutual defense agreements. Throughout the presentation, Jake watched Princess Zarathel's reactions. While the other alien delegates showed obvious boredom or contempt, she seemed genuinely interested in what the humans had to say. Her glowing eyes focused intently on each speaker, and Jake noticed that the light patterns in her crystalline skin shifted in ways that didn't match the rigid emotional control the Velnari were famous for. When the human presentation ended, the alien responses were predictable. The Thrax delegate made buzzing sounds that translated as accusations of human greed and primitive thinking. The Etherian representative's gaseous form swirled with colors that indicated deep disapproval. Each species outlined why humanity had no right to the disputed space and why their expansion should be stopped immediately. Princess Zarathel listened to each speaker with the same careful attention she had given the humans. When her turn came to respond, she stood gracefully and began to speak in the complex harmonics of her native language. The translation came through Jake's earpiece a moment later. "The Velnari Empire acknowledges the presentations of all parties," she said. "However, we find the human proposals insufficient. Your species lacks the maturity and stability necessary for territorial expansion on this scale. Your emotional nature makes you unpredictable and potentially dangerous neighbors. Jake felt his heart sink. He had hoped that Princess Zarathel's apparent interest meant she might be sympathetic to their cause. Instead, she was delivering the same rejection they had received from every other major power in the galaxy. The negotiations continued for hours, with the humans making increasingly desperate concessions. They offered to limit their expansion, to submit to alien oversight, even to restrict their population growth in exchange for recognition of their basic right to exist in the disputed space. Each offer was met with the same response. Humanity was too young, too emotional, too chaotic to be trusted with the responsibilities of interstellar civilization. As the formal session ended, Jake felt exhausted and defeated. The other human delegates gathered their materials with obvious disappointment. Ambassador Chen tried to maintain a diplomatic smile, but Jake could see the strain in her eyes. They had failed, and everyone knew it. The alien representatives filed out of the chamber, many of them making sounds that Jake's translator identified as various forms of laughter or satisfaction. The Velnari princess remained at her position, reviewing documents on a crystal tablet that seemed to grow from the table itself. Jake found himself lingering as the other humans left. He wanted to say something to her, to make one last attempt at reaching an understanding. But what could he possibly say that hadn't already been tried? Princess Zarathel was clearly intelligent and fair-minded, but she was also bound by the logical constraints of her culture. Finally, Jake followed the others out of the chamber and made his way through the crystal corridors to the guest quarters. The Velnari palace was beautiful but alien, with rooms that reshaped themselves according to the occupants' needs. Jake's quarters had adapted to human preferences, with familiar furniture and warm lighting that felt welcoming after the stark crystal chamber. Unable to sleep, Jake stepped out onto the balcony that overlooked the Velnari capital city. The sight took his breath away, as it had every night since their arrival. The city was built entirely from living crystal that grew in organic patterns, creating spires and bridges that seemed to flow like frozen music. The structures pulsed with gentle light that changed colors in rhythm with the planet's magnetic field, creating a symphony of color that painted the night sky. Standing there in the alien beauty of the crystal city, Jake felt the weight of his species' future pressing down on him. Humanity had reached so far, achieved so much, only to be told they weren't worthy of their place among the stars. The other races saw human emotions as weakness, but Jake knew they were wrong. It was human passion and determination that had carried them across the void between stars. It was human empathy that made them want to cooperate rather than conquer. As he gazed out at the flowing crystal spires, Jake's thoughts turned to Princess Zarathel. Despite her formal rejection of their proposals, he had sensed something different about her. There had been moments during the negotiations when her perfect control seemed to slip slightly, when the patterns of light in her crystalline skin had shifted in ways that suggested curiosity rather than dismissal. She was beautiful, certainly, but it was more than that. Her intelligence was obvious, but there was something else, something that reminded him of qualities he recognized in the best of humanity. She listened when others spoke, considered different viewpoints, and seemed genuinely troubled by the complexity of the situation they faced. The thought came to him unbidden, rising from the depths of his exhausted mind like a bubble breaking the surface of still water. It was impossible, ridiculous, completely against every rule of diplomacy and interspecies relations. But as Jake stood alone on the crystal balcony, looking out at the alien city that pulsed with borrowed starlight, he couldn't push the thought away. "I wish I could marry her," he whispered to the night air, his voice barely audible even to himself. The words hung in the alien atmosphere for a moment, seeming to create their own small harmony with the crystal city's eternal song. Jake closed his eyes, feeling foolish for even thinking such a thing. Princess Zarathel was not just from another species, but from a civilization that viewed his kind as primitive and emotional. The idea of any relationship between them was beyond impossible. Behind him, crystal chimed against crystal with a sound like silver bells. Jake's eyes snapped open, and he turned to see a figure materializing from the balcony wall itself. Princess Zarathel stepped forward, her crystalline form shimmering as it separated from the living stone of the palace. Her glowing eyes met his, and for the first time since he had arrived on her world, Jake saw something in them the bonding ritual. Part 2. Jake stared at Princess Zarathel in complete shock, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The beautiful alien princess stood before him on the crystal balcony, her translucent form glowing softly in the starlight. Her words echoed in his head like a melody he couldn't quite understand. "You heard me," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. "But how?" "I was speaking to myself." Princess Zarathel moved closer, her crystalline feet making no sound on the balcony floor. The light patterns in her skin shifted from deep blue to silver, creating flowing designs that seemed to respond to her emotions. "Your species fascinates me, Jake Morrison. You broadcast your feelings like songs that reach across impossible distances." Jake felt his heart racing. No alien had ever called him by his first name before. The formal distance that all other species maintained when dealing with humans seemed to have disappeared completely. "I don't understand. The Velnari don't experience emotions. Everyone knows that." "That is what my people believe," Zarathel said, her harmonic voice dropping to a whisper. "It is what I believed until your delegation arrived on our world. But something is happening to me. Something that our ancient texts call the chaos. It began the moment I first saw you in the council chamber." She stepped closer until Jake could see his own reflection in her glowing eyes. The crystalline structure of her face was incredibly detailed, with patterns that seemed to shift and change as he watched. "Your people call them emotions, do they not? These strange sensations that make my thoughts scatter like startled birds?" Jake nodded slowly, still trying to understand what was happening. "You're feeling emotions? But that's impossible. The Velnari have been beyond such things for thousands of years." "Impossible, yes," Zarathel agreed. "And yet here I stand, my perfect control shattered by the presence of one human male." She raised her hand, and Jake noticed that the crystal of her fingers was actually warm when she touched his face. "Do you know what this means for both our peoples?" Before Jake could answer, Zarathel began to explain something that chilled him to the bone. In the ancient history of the Velnari Empire, there had once been a law governing interspecies bonding. When beings from two different worlds found a connection deep enough to transcend their biological differences, they could attempt something called the harmony of souls. "It is a ritual," Zarathel said, her voice taking on the formal tone she used in the council chamber. "Two beings from different species can forge a permanent bond, a connection that joins their minds and souls across any distance. But the process is dangerous. Every couple that has attempted it in the past 5,000 years has died." Jake felt cold, despite the warm alien air. "Then why would anyone try it?" "Because if it succeeds, the bond creates something new. Not just a marriage between two individuals, but a bridge between entire civilizations. The ancient texts speak of couples who could share thoughts, combine their abilities, and understand each other on levels that normal relationships cannot reach." Zarathel walked to the edge of the balcony and looked out over her crystal city. The spires pulsed with gentle light, and Jake noticed that the patterns seemed to be responding to her presence. Where her emotions were strongest, the crystal structures glowed brighter. "There is more," she continued. "If a member of the royal family attempts the harmony of souls with an alien, it triggers ancient laws that have been dormant for millennia. The bonding must be approved by the High Council. And if it fails, both species involved are considered contaminated by chaos. They are banished from Velnari space forever." Jake's diplomatic training kicked in, and he immediately understood the implications. If he and Zarathel attempted this ritual and failed, humanity would lose any chance of peaceful coexistence with the Velnari Empire. The territorial disputes would become irrelevant because humans would be forbidden from entering this entire region of space. "But if we succeed?" Jake asked, though he was almost afraid to hear the answer. "If we succeed, our species become permanently allied. The Velnari Empire would be bound by honor to protect humanity and recognize your right to exist among the stars. Zarathel turned back to face him, and Jake saw something in her expression that looked remarkably like hope. It would be the answer to all your diplomatic problems. Jake leaned against the balcony railing, his mind racing. The offer was incredible, but the risks were beyond imagination. Why would you take such a chance? You barely know me. Because I have been studying your species in secret for months, Zarathel admitted. While the Council debates whether humans are worthy of recognition, I have been learning everything I can about your culture, your history, your way of thinking. Your emotions are not chaos, Jake Morrison. They are a form of energy that my people have forgotten how to use. She moved, closer again, and Jake noticed that the crystal structures around them were beginning to resonate with a new frequency. The balcony itself was starting to glow more brightly, as if responding to whatever was happening between them. Your feelings reach across space and touch things that should be untouchable, Zarathel continued. When you spoke of marriage, your emotional energy actually caused changes in the crystal matrix of my palace. The living stone heard you and carried your words to me, no matter where I was in the building. Jake stared at the glowing balcony beneath their feet. You're saying that human emotions can affect Velnari crystal technology? Not just affect it, Zarathel said, excitement creeping into her harmonic voice. Control it, reshape it, make it respond in ways we never thought possible. Your species possesses abilities that my people abandoned long ago in our quest for perfect logic. Before Jake could respond, an alarm began to sound across the crystal city. The pleasant chimes that normally filled the air were replaced by a harsh, discordant note that made the palace walls vibrate. Emergency lights began flashing throughout the spires, casting red shadows across the normally peaceful landscape. Zarathel's expression immediately shifted to one of concern. She placed her hand on the balcony railing, and Jake watched as information flowed through the crystal directly into her consciousness. Her eyes widened with what he recognized as fear. What is it? Jake asked. The Krextar Empire, she said, her voice tight with worry. They have been monitoring our negotiations. Their fleet is moving toward the border of our space. Jake had heard of the Krextar during his diplomatic briefings. They were a warrior species that had been at war with various galactic civilizations for centuries. Their philosophy was simple. The strong should rule, and the weak should be eliminated. They viewed the growing influence of emotional species, like humanity, as a contamination that needed to be cleansed from the galaxy. How long do we have? Jake asked. Their fastest ships will reach our outer territories in 3 days, Zarathel replied. But that is not the worst part. They have sent a message to the High Council, claiming that human emotional energy is a weapon that will destabilize galactic civilization. They demand that all emotional species be eliminated before the contamination spreads. Jake felt ice forming in his stomach. They're using humanity's presence here as an excuse to start a war. Yes, Zarathel confirmed. And there is something else? The Krextar have allies among the other species in the Galactic Council. The Thrax and the Etherians have both expressed support for their position. They see this as an opportunity to remove humanity from the galactic community permanently. The princess turned away from the railing and faced Jake directly. The light patterns in her crystalline skin were shifting rapidly now, displaying emotions that seemed to change by the second. The High Council will meet tomorrow to decide our response to the Krextar ultimatum. If they choose to surrender you to prevent war, your entire species will be handed over to an empire that believes emotional beings should not exist. Jake processed this information, feeling the weight of his species' survival settling on his shoulders. What can we do? The Harmony of Souls ritual, Zarathel said without hesitation. If we can successfully bond before the Council makes their decision, the ancient laws will force them to protect humanity. But we would have to begin immediately. And if we fail, then we die and our species become enemies forever. Zarathel stepped closer, and Jake could feel the warmth radiating from her crystal form. But if we succeed, we prove that emotions are not contamination. We show the galaxy that the connection between different species can create something stronger than either could achieve alone. Jake looked out over the Crystal City, knowing that millions of human lives hung in the balance. The decision seemed impossible, but as he stood there with the alien princess who had somehow learned to feel, he realized that some risks were worth taking. "When do we start?" he asked. Zarathel's face lit up with an expression of relief and determination. "Now," she said. "The ritual chambers are deep beneath the palace in the oldest part of our city. We must hurry before the council discovers what we are planning." As they turned to leave the balcony, neither of them noticed the small probe that detached itself from the underside of the palace structure. The Krekstar had been watching, and they had heard every word. Jake existed in a state between dreams and reality, his consciousness floating in a space that belonged neither to his human body nor to the crystalline realm of the Velnari. Through his connection with Zarathel, he could feel her presence, like a warm light in the darkness keeping him anchored to something resembling life. Time moved strangely in their merged state. Sometimes seconds felt like hours, and sometimes what seemed like days passed in an instant. Jake gradually became aware that their incomplete bonding had created something that the ancient Velnari texts had never described. They were not fully merged, but they were no longer separate either. Slowly, Jake began to understand that he could still move, still think, still act. His body had been changed by the crystal energy flowing through him, becoming something that was part human and part living crystal. When he looked at his hands, he could see patterns of blue light flowing beneath his skin, and he realized that Zarathel had literally given part of her essence to keep him alive. Zarathel appeared beside him, her form more solid than the shifting energy she had become during the bonding crisis. She too had been changed. Her crystalline features now showed expressions that were unmistakably human in their warmth and complexity. The rigid perfection of Velnari emotional control had been replaced by something far more alive. "How long have we been here?" Jake asked, his voice carrying harmonics that he had never possessed before. 3 days, Zarathel replied. The Krekstar attack was only the beginning. Their main fleet has arrived at the edge of our solar system, and they have brought allies. Half the species in the Galactic Council have joined them. Through their connection, Jake felt her transfer information directly into his mind. The situation had become desperate while they were trapped in the ritual chamber. The Krekstar had convinced the other alien civilizations that human emotional energy was indeed a dangerous weapon that threatened the stability of the galaxy. "They call it the emotional plague," Zarathel continued. "They claim that humans are spreading chaos throughout space, contaminating logical species and causing them to become unstable. The Thrax Empire has contributed warships, and even the peaceful Etherians have agreed to support military action." Jake processed this information, feeling anger and determination flowing through him in ways that seemed to resonate with the crystal structures around them. The chamber walls pulsed with light in response to his emotions, and he realized that their incomplete bonding had given them abilities that neither species possessed alone. "What about your people?" Jake asked. "What has the Velnari High Council decided?" Zarathel's expression became troubled. "They are divided. The traditionalists want to surrender humanity to prevent war, but others have begun to experience what they call the awakening. Your emotional energy has been affecting Velnari across our entire world. Many of my people are beginning to feel things they have not experienced for thousands of years." She showed him images through their mental connection. Throughout the crystal cities of the Velnari homeworld, citizens were experiencing emotions for the first time in their lives. Some were terrified by the chaos of feelings, but others were discovering joy, wonder, and connections with each other that they had never thought possible. "The High Council is meeting now to make their final decision," Zarathel said. "If they choose to hand your species over to the Krekstar, the war fleet will move to Earth within days. But if they choose to protect humanity, our world becomes the first target for destruction." Jake stood up, testing his transformed body. He felt stronger than before, more aware of his surroundings, and connected to the crystal technology around. him in ways that seemed almost magical. Then we need to give them a reason to choose protection over surrender. How? Zarathel asked. We are only 2 individuals. The combined fleet outside our solar system has enough firepower to destroy entire planets. Jake looked around the ancient chamber, feeling the flow of energy through the crystal networks that connected every part of the Velnari civilization. Through his new abilities, he could sense the harmonic frequencies that controlled their technology, and he began to understand something that neither the Krextar nor the Galactic Council had considered. They think human emotions are a weapon, Jake said slowly. But what if they're actually a tool? What if the reason we can affect your crystal technology is because emotions are a form of quantum energy that can reshape matter at the subatomic level? Zarathel's eyes widened as she followed his reasoning. You think our bonding has unlocked something that was always possible? I think your ancestors didn't suppress their emotions because they were primitive, Jake replied. I think they suppressed them because they were too powerful. But now we know how to control that power. Through their connection, Jake began sharing an idea that had been forming in his mind. If human emotional energy could affect Velnari crystal, technology, and if their incomplete bonding had created a bridge between their species, then perhaps they could extend that bridge to others. The other human-alien pairs, Jake said excitedly. Ambassador Chen mentioned that some of our diplomats have been forming friendships with members of other species. What if those connections could be strengthened the same way ours was? Zarathel understood immediately. A network of emotional bonds across multiple species. Each connection would allow the sharing of abilities and perspectives, creating understanding where there was once only mistrust. They began to work together, using their combined abilities to reach out through the crystal networks of the Velnari homeworld. Jake's human intuition guided them to find other points of connection, while Zarathel's harmonic abilities amplified their signal across impossible distances. To their amazement, they discovered that emotional connections already existed throughout the galaxy. Human diplomats who had formed genuine friendships with alien colleagues, traders who had learned to trust each other across species lines, even soldiers who had fought together and formed bonds of respect and loyalty. Each of these connections was like a seed that could be awakened and strengthened. Jake and Zarathel began sending out harmonic frequencies that carried the template of their own bond, showing other pairs how to deepen their emotional connections into something more permanent. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Across dozens of worlds, humans and aliens began forming bonds similar to the one Jake and Zarathel shared. Each new connection created a node in a growing network of understanding that spanned the galaxy. But the process was not without danger. As the network grew stronger, it began to interfere with the quantum signatures that the Krextar fleet used for navigation and communication. Their warships started experiencing system failures as human emotional energy disrupted their purely logical computer systems. The Krextar commander, a massive warrior named Vectar the Destroyer, realized what was happening and ordered an immediate attack on the Velnari homeworld. If the emotional plague could not be contained, then it would have to be eliminated at its source. They're coming, Zarathel said, her voice tight with fear as she monitored the approaching fleet through the planetary defense networks. 600 warships, all focused on destroying our world. Jake felt a moment of doubt. Their network of emotional bonds was growing, but it was still fragile and incomplete. The Krextar had enough firepower to destroy the Velnari homeworld before their experiment could prove itself. But then he felt something that changed everything. Through their network, other bonded pairs across the galaxy were reaching back to them, offering their own strength and abilities. Human creativity was combining with alien technologies in ways that created entirely new possibilities. A Thrax engineer bonded with a human scientist had discovered how to use emotional energy to enhance their species' natural ability to manipulate quantum fields. An Etherian philosopher connected with a human teacher had learned to use feelings to communicate across dimensions. Each new bond added capabilities that neither species possessed alone. We're not just creating understanding, Jake realized. We're creating evolution. Every species that forms these emotional connections becomes more than they were before. Zarathel smiled, her crystalline features glowing with joy and determination. Then let us show the galaxy what evolution looks like. Together, they reached out through their network to every bonded pair in known space. The message they sent was simple but profound. Emotions were not chaos to be feared, but strength to be embraced. The connections between different species were not contamination, but the next step in galactic civilization. As the Krextar fleet entered the Velnari solar system with weapons charged and ready to fire, they found themselves facing something they had never encountered before. The planets themselves had become part of the emotional network, their crystal cities and harmonic technologies amplified by human feelings and alien logic working in perfect harmony. The war that followed would determine not just the fate of humanity and the Velnari, but the future of consciousness itself throughout the galaxy. The Krextar fleet filled the space around the Velnari homeworld like a storm of metal and fire. 600 warships hung in the darkness, their weapons powered and ready to turn the crystal planet into glowing dust. Commander Vectar the Destroyer stood on the bridge of his flagship, his massive form encased in battle armor that had never known defeat. "Begin bombardment of the planet's surface," Vectar commanded, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a warrior who had conquered dozens of worlds. "Target the crystal cities first. We will burn the emotional plague from the galaxy." But as the first wave of energy beams lanced toward the planet, something unexpected happened. The beams struck an invisible barrier that surrounded the entire world, creating ripples of light that spread across the planet's surface like water. The Velnari homeworld had become something more than a simple planet. It had become part of the emotional network that Jake and Zarathel had created. Deep beneath the Crystal Palace, Jake felt the impact of every weapon strike through his connection to the planetary consciousness. The pain was intense, but it was shared across thousands of bonded pairs throughout the galaxy. What should have been devastating became manageable, spread across so many minds that no single person bore the full burden. "The shield is holding," Zarathel said, her voice filled with wonder as she monitored the planetary defenses. "But it won't last forever. We need to do something more than just defend." Jake nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility for every human life in the galaxy. Through the network he could sense his own species scattered across dozens of worlds, all looking to him and Zarathel for salvation. But he could also feel something else, something that gave him hope. "They're not just attacking us," Jake realized. "They're attacking the idea of connection itself. The Krextar are afraid that if emotional bonds spread throughout the galaxy, their way of life will become obsolete." Through their shared consciousness, Jake and Zarathel began to understand the true nature of their enemy. The Krextar Empire was built on the idea that only the strong should survive, that cooperation was weakness, and that different species should remain separate and pure. The emotional network threatened everything they believed in. "Then we show them a different way," Zarathel said, her crystalline form beginning to glow with determination. "We show them what strength really looks like." Together they reached out through the network to every bonded pair in the galaxy, sharing a plan that was as ambitious as it was dangerous. Instead of fighting the Krextar fleet with weapons, they would try to connect with them emotionally. They would offer the warrior species the one thing they had never experienced: understanding. The response from their network was immediate and powerful. Across the galaxy, thousands of bonded pairs began to focus their combined emotional energy toward the Krextar fleet. Human empathy merged with alien logic, creating frequencies that could penetrate even the most heavily shielded warrior minds. At first, the effect was chaos. Krextar warriors throughout the fleet began experiencing emotions for the first time in their species' history. Fear, doubt, curiosity, and compassion flooded through minds that had only known aggression and dominance. Many of the warriors collapsed, overwhelmed by feelings they had no framework to understand. Commander Vectar felt the emotional wave strike his consciousness like a physical blow. For a terrifying moment, he experienced something completely foreign to his nature. He felt what it was like to be afraid, to doubt his actions, to wonder if there might be another way besides endless war. "What is this sorcery?" Vectar roared, fighting against the alien sensations flooding his mind. "All ships increase bombardment. Destroy the source of this contamination." But even as he gave the order, Vectar found himself remembering things he had forgotten. The young warriors under his command who had died in countless battles. The civilizations he had destroyed without ever trying to understand them. The loneliness of a life spent in constant conflict. Throughout the Krextar fleet, similar struggles were taking place. Warriors who had never questioned their purpose were suddenly experiencing doubt. Soldiers who had only known how to destroy were feeling the desire to create. Ship commanders were hesitating before firing weapons that would end millions of lives. Some of the Krextar vessels stopped firing entirely, their crews paralyzed by the overwhelming experience of feeling empathy for their enemies. Others began to withdraw from the battle, unable to continue an attack against beings they were beginning to understand as fellow conscious creatures. But not all of the warriors were affected. The oldest and most disciplined among them fought against the emotional invasion, using their training to suppress the foreign feelings. Nearly 200 ships continued their assault on the planetary shields, their weapons growing more intense as their commanders tried to break through before their crews could be further contaminated. Jake felt the strain as the planetary defenses began to weaken. The emotional network was powerful, but it couldn't hold back such concentrated firepower indefinitely. Something more was needed, something that would prove once and for all that connection was stronger than conquest. "We need to show them what we've become," Jake said to Zarathel. "Not just tell them, but let them experience it directly." Zarathel understood immediately. Together, they began to open their merged consciousness to the entire galaxy, sharing not just their emotions but their memories, their thoughts, their very essence. Every being in the network suddenly experienced what it felt like to be truly bonded with another consciousness. Human diplomats felt what it was like to think with crystalline logic. Alien scientists experienced human intuition and creativity. Warriors from a dozen different species felt the warmth of friendship across biological barriers. For the first time in galactic history, beings from different worlds truly understood each other. The effect on the Krextar fleet was immediate and profound. Even the most disciplined warriors found themselves overwhelmed by the experience of genuine connection. They felt what it was like to be part of something larger than themselves, to be valued not for their strength, but for their unique perspective and abilities. Commander Vectar stood frozen on his bridge as the full impact of the revelation struck him. Through the network, he experienced the memories and feelings of beings he had spent his life trying to destroy. He felt the love between Jake and Zarathel, the friendship between human and alien diplomats, the respect between former enemies who had learned to work together. For the first time in his long life, Vectar understood that strength did not come from standing alone, but from connecting with others. His warrior's pride had blinded him to the possibility that cooperation could achieve things that conquest never could. "All ships," Vectar said quietly, his voice carrying across the fleet communication channels. "Cease fire." The bombardment stopped, leaving the space around the Velnari homeworld eerily quiet. 600 warships hung motionless in the darkness, their crews struggling to process emotions and concepts that challenged everything they had ever believed. Jake and Zarathel rose from the depths of the Crystal Palace, their forms now existing as something between matter and energy, individual and collective consciousness. They appeared in the space between the planet and the fleet, visible to every ship in both forces. "We offer you a choice," Jake said, his voice carrying across the void through the emotional network. "You can continue to live as you always have, isolated and afraid of connection. Or you can join us in building something new." "What we offer is not weakness," Zarathel added, her harmonic voice creating frequencies that resonated through every hull and every heart. "It is evolution, the chance to become more than any single species could achieve alone." Commander Vectar stepped forward in his command center, removing his helmet for the first time in decades. His scarred face was wet with tears he did not fully understand. What would you have us do? Learn, Jake replied simply. Share. Connect. Help us build a galaxy where different species work together instead of fighting each other. One by one, the Krekstar ships began to power down their weapons. Across the fleet, warriors who had only known conflict began to experience something they had never imagined possible. Peace. In the months that followed, the galaxy transformed in ways that no one could have predicted. The emotional network continued to grow, connecting species that had been enemies for centuries. The Krekstar became protectors instead of destroyers, using their warrior skills to defend the weak rather than conquer them. Jake and Zarathel became the first ambassadors of the New Age, traveling between worlds to help other species learn how to form the deep connections that made true cooperation possible. They existed now as both individuals and a unified consciousness, able to appear separately when needed, but sharing a bond that spanned the cosmos. The territorial disputes that had brought humanity to the Velnari homeworld became irrelevant, as species learned to share resources and knowledge instead of fighting over them. The galaxy's first truly integrated council was formed, with representatives from dozens of worlds working together to explore the universe and unlock its mysteries. And, in the crystal cities of the Velnari homeworld where it all began, a new couple stood on a